scariest monsters are the ones that lurk within our souls, a horrifying quote from the master of the macabre himself, Edgar Allan Poe. His life and his tragic death have permeated the world of literature for the past 2 centuries, and the mystery of it all has fascinated those who like to satisfy their morbid curiosities for just as long. In 1849, Edgar Allan Poe disappeared without a trace for 6 whole days, and when he reappeared, he was in an alarming state of delirium for another few days before he passed away in a Baltimore hospital. The circumstances, the official cause, and official manner of Poe's death remain elusive to this day, which leaves us all with the question of what in the world could have happened to him. So, hello, I'm Anna, and this is episode 41 of the Crime Bistro podcast, an episode that I could not be more excited for. Today we are telling the story of the tragic life and mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe himself, and we're exploring the multitude of theories as to how he might have met his eventual end. And we're also going to talk about a brand new theory, one that I have never seen or heard covered in relation to this case, about a long-held family secret. It's all very fascinating and really exciting, which means that we are going to need some serious caffeination for this one. So with me right now, I have a ginger chamomile tea. It's still kind of morning time. I already had some caffeine this morning and I can't have too much more, so that's why. But grab your own coffee, caffeinated beverage, or emotional support water bottle, and let's dive into the horrifying case and the tragic death of Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19th of 1809 in a boarding house in Boston, Massachusetts, to his parents David Poe Jr. and Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins, who were both actors. Because he was born to parents who were actors, David and Elizabeth traveled the theater circuit up and down the East Coast, leaving Edgar and his younger sister Rosalie, who was born in 1810, with their grandparents, David Sr. and Elizabeth, at their house in Baltimore. He also had a brother who was 2 years older than him named William Henry. Edgar's mother, Elizabeth, was a renowned actress in her own right. Even though at the time people really did look down on acting as a profession, Elizabeth was really highly regarded, especially in the city of Richmond, where she would eventually pass away. Edgar's father, however, was not at all well known for his abilities as an actor, and his career was heavily impacted by his own drinking issues. Even apart from the drinking, however, David Poe's character was definitely not one that would be considered favorable. And Edgar's early life only got more tumultuous as time went on. Really, from the time that he was born, his story just gets more and more tragic, and it becomes pretty clear very quickly where the inspiration for a lot of his works did come from. Before he had even turned 2, Edgar's father, David, abandoned the family in 1811, and he would pass away in December of that same year. Horrifically, Elizabeth, his mother, would contract tuberculosis, and she would also die on December 8th of 1811 at the age of only 24, and his parents actually only passed away 3 days apart from one another. With the death of both parents, Edgar, William Henry, and Rosalie now didn't really have anywhere to go, since their grandparents in Baltimore couldn't afford to take care of them, so both of them needed to find care with other families. Rosalie was adopted by a merchant in Richmond, Virginia named William Mackenzie, and William Henry was placed into a foster home also in Virginia. Edgar actually wasn't ever formally adopted, but he was taken in by a tobacco merchant whose name was John Allan, and John's wife named Frances. Frances had actually been a really big fan of Elizabeth Poe as an actress. With John and Frances Allan now as his caretakers, Edgar was given his middle name, and from there would be known as Edgar Allan Poe. The Allan family did have the money to support Edgar, and so he was given the opportunity to pursue literature from a very young age. This pursuit of literature, though, did kind of cause a rift between him and John Allan, since Edgar was really kind of like a polished Southern gentleman, whereas his foster father was a little bit more rough and tumble, but Frances especially was very doting and very affectionate towards Edgar during his childhood. As a young man, he would be described as a natural leader and actually quite the athlete as well, which I had no idea about. He actually swam 6 miles upstream the James River when he was only 15, which is kind of insane to think about. And he showed promise in the literary field from when he was very young, likely taking after his mother Elizabeth since he had this really unique ability to memorize and recite really long poetry passages. Another part of Poe's childhood that would have a significant impact on his eventual career was the family's move to Liverpool, England in 1815, when Poe was actually only 6 years old. John Allan was hoping to be able to open a branch office there since he was a merchant, but for Edgar, this exposed him to an entirely new culture and a lot of new people, which would end up being a really big inspiration for him later on in life. He went to a boarding school starting at the age of 6, and then a couple of years later, at age 9, he studied at the Manor House of Reverend John Bransby. Many of the people who Poe interacted with in London would eventually reappear as characters in his later writings. However, John Allan's office in England did not pan out, and Frances became very sick, so the family returned to Richmond, Virginia in June of 1820. Once there, Edgar began to study under Joseph Clark, learning mathematics as well as classical literature. Clark noticed Edgar's astounding ability as a writer of poetry and really started to encourage him. In 1823, Edgar also started to study with William Burke, where he learned Latin, French, and Italian, as well as geography and grammar. In 1825, Edgar enrolled at the University of Virginia. His foster mother, Frances, had fallen ill with tuberculosis, and John Allan had been having affairs with other women pretty openly after Frances had gotten sick, so he kind of just wanted Edgar out of the house at this point, and he gave him just enough money to go to school. He took 2 classes at the University of Virginia, Ancient Languages and Modern Languages, which I just have to say, wouldn't it be so fascinating to go back to the 1800s and take a language class? I cannot imagine how interesting that would be. Edgar was initially pretty successful at the university, and his classmates were completely fascinated by his imagination. He would draw all over the walls and the ceiling of his room, and he would read his writings to them as well. Edgar's gambling problem first became an issue during this time because John Allan had only provided him with the money to go to school. There was nothing left over for food or clothes or any other necessities. So to try and make things work, he tried his hand at gambling, which obviously always ends really well, and he did find himself in about $2,000 worth of debt in 1827 dollars too, so today that would be a lot more. This meant that Edgar had to leave the University of Virginia and move back to Richmond, where he worked in Allan's finance department. In July of 1827, Edgar published his first poetry collection, Tamerlane and Other Poems, under the pseudonym A Bostonian. However, his writing wasn't exactly paying the bills, and he was still drowning in debt, so to kind of escape this, he enlisted in the army under the name Edgar A. Perry and would report to Fort Independence in Boston Harbor before being transferred to Fort Moultrie. He was still writing at this time, but he wouldn't publish any poetry under his own name until 1829, when he published Al-Araf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems. On April 1st of 1829, he made the decision to leave the army, and then he returned to Baltimore to live with a cousin. But on June 20th of 1830, he actually enrolled at West Point despite being over the age limit. Here, he excelled in his French and his math classes, but would be expelled a year later, March 6th of 1831, for missing classes and for missing roll calls. He was really disliking the intensive structure, is kind of the only way to put it, which is slightly odd since he was in the army before, but maybe West Point training at the time was just a little bit more intensive. I've definitely heard that it is. But either way, he moved back to Baltimore, and he moved in with his Aunt Maria Clem and her 9-year-old daughter, Virginia. He did start to see a good amount of success in his writing career after returning to Baltimore, publishing some short stories in the Philadelphia Saturday Courier and the Baltimore Saturday Visitor in 1832 and 1833. He did end up getting a job as the assistant editor at the Southern Literary Messenger, where he was writing columns for about $15 per week, which wasn't bad. For work, Edgar moved back to Richmond around 1835, but he really suffered a major downward spiral for the first few months that he was there. He sank into a deep depression, and his drinking started to get really out of control, to the point where he was actually fired from his job, though he would be given the job back on the condition that he stopped drinking. The trigger for this depression was the news that his Aunt Maria, who he had been living with in Baltimore, was thinking of having her daughter Virginia go and live with other relatives. At the time, these two were the only family that Edgar really had, and they were honestly the only people that he had at all. Maria and Virginia, his aunt and her daughter, moved from Richmond to Baltimore to be with Edgar around this time as well. In May of 1936, he would marry Virginia with Maria's permission, and she was only 13 years old while he was 26. I honestly don't really have anything to say about that. It's a horrible part of his story. It's obviously very disturbing, but again, there's nothing that I can say about it that you're not already thinking while you're listening to this. Their marriage certificate at the time even inflated Virginia's age from 13 to 21, so clearly they did know that this wasn't exactly a good thing. He was, however, really devoted and caring towards Virginia. People said that they were extremely happy and a joy to be around when they were together. There's even stories of the two of them playing leapfrog in a park in New York. Virginia seemed to be a muse for Poe, more than even a partner, really, and he featured her as the inspiration for many of his tragically beautiful, ill, and fragile characters, most notably perhaps Madeline in The Fall of the House of Usher. Edgar worked for a variety of different magazines as an editor over the years, where he was also publishing and writing his poems and his short stories, as well as serving as a literary critic, writing critiques for some authors whose names you probably have heard before: William Cullen Bryant, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Nathaniel Hawthorne, William Washington Irving, and Charles Dickens. Sounds kind of familiar, but who knows? And as a literary critic, his reviews were so ruthless that he was actually called Tomahawk. One of his critiques of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was so scathing that he actually went as far as to accuse him of plagiarizing. So he was definitely a volatile man and very angry in the 1830s in particular. He also published his first and only novel in 1838 called The Narrative of Arthas Gordon Pym of Nantucket. Something that all of you true crime listeners out there might find fascinating, since I definitely did, is that in April of 1841, Edgar Allan Poe published The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and in doing so, essentially created an entirely new genre of literature, detective stories. Isn't that insane? Like, one of the most morbidly famous historical figures was responsible for creating detective stories in writing. It's really haunting, but it's also very, very cool. This was appropriately called the most important short story of the 1800s, and actually would later be the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes himself. One of his most famous works, and the one that brought him a huge amount of fame at the time, was The Raven, which was published in the New York Tribune, Southern Literary Messenger, and Richmond Examiner. It was thought to be the most popular poem ever written by an American, and get this, he only earned $14 in total from writing The Raven. Another one of his most notorious pieces came out in 1842, The Mask of the Red Death, referring to tuberculosis, which was the disease that had ripped away many of Poe's loved ones over the years. Throughout experiencing all of this success in his literary career, however, Edgar Allan Poe was really haunted by his own demons, and his life really was tragic. In 1829, his foster mother, Frances, had died of tuberculosis. This was a loss that upset him very deeply. He had been orphaned by two mothers and abandoned and rejected by two father figures, which is just completely unimaginable. Only a short time later, Poe's older brother, William Henry, would also die of tuberculosis in 1831. In 1834, John Allan passed away, and even though Edgar was the foster son that his wife had loved so dearly, John had so much resentment towards Edgar that he not only threatened Edgar from his literal deathbed, but he also left him out of his will entirely. And among all of the illegitimate children that John Allan had, Edgar was the only child that was left out of his will. In 1842, while watching his wife Virginia sing to him and her mother Maria, Virginia coughed slightly and a drop of blood appeared on her lips. And it was at that moment that Edgar realized that his wife and his only real love and companion had tuberculosis, the disease that had killed everyone else in his life. Virginia died in January of 1847 after struggling severely with tuberculosis for about 3 years, and this really affected him. He wrote less and less after her death, and he really started to spiral. His drinking got severely worse, and he also started experiencing bouts of paranoia. With all of the premature deaths of his loved ones that Edgar experienced, starting from the age of 2 with the death of his mother, it's thought that his shockingly morbid writings stem from his desire to be closer to the afterlife and that he wanted to find some sort of connection to it. Edgar Allan Poe's health, particularly his mental and emotional stability, were on a serious decline, really from the time that he was a child, but all of this would eventually come to a head in 1849. In September of 1849, Edgar Allan Poe went to Richmond to visit a former girlfriend of his who had recently been widowed just like himself, named Elmira Shelton. The two of them did get engaged at that time to be married. So on the 27th of September, Edgar left Richmond and got on a boat to Baltimore, leaving his belongings behind in Richmond. After that, no one saw Edgar, heard from him, or had any clue where he was for the next 6 days. Given his mental state at the time and his history of alcohol abuse as well as depression, people didn't really know what to think, but whatever it is, they knew that he wasn't missing for any positive reason. It's not like he was just, going on a vacation to clear his head. A cousin posited that he might have been suffering from hallucinations, which he did have a history of at this point. The next time that somebody saw Edgar was on the 3rd of October when Joseph Walker was walking down a Baltimore street and saw him semi-conscious outside of an Irish tavern called Gunner's Hall. Imagine the shock that this man experienced when he realized that the person that he was looking at was the famous author and poet Edgar Allan Poe. This was 1849, so word doesn't travel as fast as it does today, but this man did end up sending a letter to Dr. Joseph Snodgrass. You did hear me correctly. His name was actually Snodgrass, and I think that that's fantastic. But anyways, Dr. Snodgrass made his way to Baltimore, where he found Edgar dressed in clothes that were not his. At that point, he was pretty much unconscious. Keep in mind as well, Poe throughout his life, despite his destitute status, was always very well polished, and in public he always looked very put together, so that does add another unusual aspect to this story. He was transported to Washington College Hospital, where he was admitted under the care of Dr. John Moran. At the hospital, it was really clear that he was in a very compromised mental state, and his physical health was shockingly bad. He had tremors and hallucinations that lasted for 2 days, described by Dr. Moran as delirium. October 7th of 1849 dawned, and Edgar's behavior started with most of the same, just basically confusion, but soon he got very quiet and just whispered to himself, "Lord, help my poor soul," his last words. After 5 days of suffering in the hospital, Edgar passed away at 5 a.m. on Sunday, October 7th of 1849, at only 40 years old. Now, it's certainly worth mentioning that Dr. Moran himself is kind of a sketchy character. He gave many differing accounts to friends and press about the final days of Edgar's life, and he also would not allow Poe any visitors while he was in the hospital. Moran also claimed that the night before Poe died, he was repeatedly calling out the name Reynolds, another fact that has never been confirmed and also cannot be concretely connected to anyone in Poe's life. Dr. Moran also did something very strange after Poe passed away, and he claimed that he himself bought the coffin that Poe was buried in, which is completely unfounded and very untrue. So I'm not sure what's going on with this doctor, but he's a really odd character in this story. Officially, his cause of death was congestion of the brain, though there doesn't seem to be an actual death certificate for Poe, which means either it's lost or it never existed in the first place. And that also makes me feel a little bit odd about this Dr. Moran character, because if I'm not wrong, signing the death certificate would have been the responsibility of the doctor who cared for him. But nonetheless, with only a few people in attendance, Poe was buried only the next day in an unmarked grave at Baltimore's Presbyterian Cemetery in a service conducted by Reverend William Clem, who was Virginia's cousin. 26 years later, his remains would be exhumed and reburied underneath a statue in the same cemetery that does identify his grave. Now, as we talked about, Edgar Allan Poe had pretty much established the modern equation for writing a detective story and had really invented that genre as we know it. His detective stories brought us the impossible crime, a brilliant but eccentric detective, and a narrator to explain the crime's solution. His detective stories were thrilling, they were creative, cunning, and completely engaging. And what if those crimes transcended his pages and manifested in his own life? You have to admit, his death is odd, and there's very little information that's concrete about it, and there are definitely more than a few questions that we could ask. So, let's go through the theories about what might have actually happened to Edgar Allan Poe. Obviously, the most commonly known theory in this case is that Poe died as the result of a days-long alcohol binge, where many people do point to his prior issues with substance abuse. Interestingly, Poe had a rare hereditary defect, which was an extreme intolerance to alcohol, and he would actually be incredibly impaired after having only one drink. People who saw Edgar in Richmond did say that he seemed very physically unwell, and there are accounts of him drinking while he was there. There is a huge problem with this theory, though. It does explain why he might have died, but offers no explanation for where on earth he disappeared to for 6 entire days, or how he ended up wearing somebody else's clothes. Additionally, there was not a point in the hospital where Edgar wasn't delirious or suffering, and you would expect this to have worn off at some point over those multiple days. Modern tests on Poe's hair samples showed low levels of lead in his system. Because of the prevalence of lead in both alcoholic beverages and bottles in the 1800s, this is a common metric for determining if somebody was drunk or was drinking. But the levels that Poe had indicated that he likely had not been drinking. He had also become a serious advocate of prohibition in the months before he died, which obviously doesn't mean that he wasn't drinking, but coupled with the fact that he had been warned by a doctor recently that it would impact his physical health greatly to drink because of this intolerance to alcohol, and likely kill him, actually, if he drank again, something does strike me as strange here. Poe had spent his life trying to find love and trying to find a family, and he was elated to have reconnected with this old girlfriend and to become engaged to Elmira Shelton. So unless he were trying to end his own life, this theory to me just needs a little bit more evidence to back it up. So personally, I kind of think that the jury is out on this one. Maybe it played a part, but with there being so many conflicting stories of whether or not Poe was actually drunk when he was first admitted to the hospital, it's really hard to say that it was definitely alcohol that was the cause. That being said, Poe was in pretty poor health in general, which he did refer to in several letters to his Aunt Maria in 1849. Doctors at the time that Poe died did say that they had diagnosed him with the flu and told him not to travel to Baltimore because he was too ill. Assuming that it really was the flu, I'm assuming because medical care in 1849 isn't exactly what it is today. If Poe had arrived in Baltimore without rest to a cold and rainy environment, which it was, his symptoms could have become drastically worse very quickly, and we all know that high fevers can cause delirium. The other illness that people have really theorized about recently is rabies. Poe's symptoms have been recorded as lethargy, confusion, hallucinations, variations to his heart rate, as well as rapid, shallow breathing, all of which is consistent with rabies, and the average survival rate for rabies is about 4 days, which would be consistent with Poe's death. Another consideration is really just more to do with the time period in general, considering that there was lead in a lot of bottles and other very dangerous heavy metals that people were just unaware of in the 1800s. Strands of Poe's hair would be tested posthumously, where these tests showed elevated levels of mercury, and mercury poisoning could absolutely cause hallucinations and delirium, considering that he had been prescribed mercury chloride after being exposed to cholera. The levels of mercury that they found were below that which could cause mercury poisoning, but it is interesting to consider since it might not be the only substance that he was ever exposed to. At this point, if he really did die of more natural causes, with all of the extremely concerning reports about his health, if his death was not sinister in manner, that it was probably some horrific combination of all of these things. This theory is super fascinating to me, and it's that Poe was a victim of a very unique type of crime, a political kidnapping, which is known as cooping in the 1800s. It was Election Day in Baltimore, and at the time, it was pretty common for politicians to hire criminals to kidnap people. These victims would be given liquor, they would be threatened and sometimes physically assaulted, and then they would be forced to vote for a specific candidate, many times while wearing different disguises. Today, it's not such a dramatic process, but the end result is the same: election fraud. Now, this one does get me a little bit because there's a lot that can be explained by it. Not only would it explain the period of time that Edgar was missing for, but if he was in such poor health as we just talked about, it's not likely that he would have survived an ordeal like this, especially if he had been plied with alcohol. Considering his extreme intolerance for alcohol, the hereditary condition that he had, if he had been plied with alcohol by kidnappers, he would have ended up in a very distressed state at the very least, and other accounts of victims of cooping have seen people ending up in a state that was very similar to Poe's, being essentially just abandoned in the gutter. And Gunner's Hall, where he was found, was notorious for these political kidnappings at the time. This one is really tough because this theory took about 23 years to come to fruition, and it was first suggested in 1872. But to be fair, it's not as if people could really be super open about how common the practice was in Baltimore at the time that Poe died. It's interesting to me as well because it kind of ties together the missing days in his timeline, as well as his physical ailments contributing to this type of ordeal being life-ending for Poe. And honestly, I do think that whatever did happen, Edgar's death was certainly a combination of a couple of different things because he had a lot going on health-wise. We do obviously have to recognize, though, that there is no physical evidence for this, and the only potential witness came forward in an anonymous letter in the 1870s, so that's not super reliable, obviously. Also consider the fact that Edgar was pretty well known in Baltimore, so that would make him a less likely target as a kidnapping of this nature. And of course, in a case as macabre as this, we have to consider the theory that Edgar Allan Poe was murdered in cold blood. This was a theory that was put forth by author John Evangelist Walsh. According to Walsh, in a book that he wrote about Edgar, he believes that the poet was killed by the brothers of Elmira Shelton, the woman who Edgar had just gotten engaged to. Elmira was from a family that was really well off, and Edgar was extremely poor, really, and at that point in his life he didn't have anything besides his writings to his name. So considering the time period, it does make sense that Elmira's family wouldn't want her marrying someone from such a drastically different social standing. Most people, though, consider this theory to be extremely entertaining, but not at all likely. A less sensationalized version of events here is that it's possible that Poe was mugged and had just fallen victim to a random crime of opportunity, though again, there's really no evidence for it. It hasn't really been explored, so it's kind of difficult to count that one as one of my top theories. Continuing with the idea that Edgar was met with foul play, I found a very interesting theory posited by somebody in the comments of a YouTube video. I know that sounds unreliable, but bear with me. The person's username is EdwinPool257, and I'm just going to read the post to you since this is the first time that I've ever heard or ever seen anybody talk about this theory regarding the death of Edgar Allan Poe. I grew up being told a family legend that our ancestor killed Poe. In the last few years, my wife got really into genealogy and tracked my heritage back to a man named John Hill Hewitt. He and Poe hated each other and would compete in writing competitions and bash each other in editorials and papers. My wife found his autobiography and he said something to the effect of, quote, "I saw Allan a few days before his death. He apologized for how he'd treated me and we shared a few drinks," end quote. Knowing what we now know about alcohol's effects on Poe, that sounds exactly like something that a person who killed Edgar Allan Poe would write in an autobiography. Which is super fascinating and obviously very fantastical to think about, so I really did have to actually look into this one, and here's what I found out about John Hill Hewitt. He was born in 1801 in New York City to John Hewitt, his father, who was a prominent musician. After his father was commissioned as a musician for a theater company in Augusta, Georgia, John Hill Hewitt moved to the South and he fell in love with the people there and the hospitality there, staying even after the company failed. He did see great success as a musician throughout his life, writing America's first international hit song in 1825 called "The Minstrels Returned from the War." In 1828, Hewitt found a job in Baltimore as a newspaper and magazine editor, which is when he became connected with Edgar, who was also in Baltimore at the time. In 1829, Poe had a collection of poetry published in Baltimore, which received some excellent attention, yet John Hill Hewitt had some pretty terrible things to say about it, calling this collection, quote, "a literary curiosity full of burning thoughts which so charm the reader that he forgets he is traveling over a pile of brickbats," end quote. Later, in October of 1833, there was a poetry contest that was sponsored by the Baltimore Saturday Visitor. In this contest, Edgar's poem "The Colosseum" was given second place. Now, here's where it gets a little strange. The first place winner was John Hill Hewitt, who submitted a poem called "Song of the Wind," but under a pseudonym, Henry Wilton. It's this poetry contest that is thought to have really cemented the feud and hatred between Hewitt and Poe, which lasted until Poe's death in 1849. In fact, Poe believed that Hewitt had actually rigged this poetry award because of Hewitt's previous harsh criticisms of Poe's work, and when they later met by chance in the street, they actually got into a physical fist fight with one another, and a huge argument ensued as well. Their families were connected as well, which is interesting. In April of 1846, Mary Hewitt, who was John Hill Hewitt's wife, wrote a letter to Poe expressing her concerns about a recent illness that he had in Baltimore. So it would seem that they were either closer acquaintances than history tells, or that they knew a lot of the same people and ran in the same circles. What is interesting is that Hewitt seemed to have a lot of resentment towards people who he perceived to be more successful than him. He would later write that Poe's reputation was undeserved and even would accuse him of plagiarizing The Raven, his most famous work arguably of all time. Now, I'm not at all saying that Hewitt had something to do with Poe's death, but it's definitely worth considering, especially because they had been violent towards each other in the past. If Hewitt somehow ran into Poe during those days where he was missing, saw that he was in a vulnerable physical and mental state, and then used the opportunity to perhaps exact his own revenge or act on the hatred that he harbored towards the poet, I mean, it's definitely not out of the question. So what actually happened when the master of the macabre fell to a heavily suspicious and horribly terrifying death of his own? Honestly, I have no idea. Now, I do think we have to take into account the fact that Poe had this intolerance for alcohol, as well as his sicknesses that preceded his death and his declining physical and mental health over the past really 15 years of his life. His life was plagued with devastation and death and illness, and he also spent a lot of time as a caretaker to his wife, Virginia, who, despite the age difference, he really did love, and as a lot of us know, unfortunately, it can be extremely taxing and very draining emotionally to be a caretaker to somebody. And I don't want to speculate too much on this, but I will say from the way that Poe himself and people close to the couple, as well as historians, describe this marriage, it wasn't really a romantic connection between the two of them, as it was Poe just kind of searching for companionship. I think that Poe's life predisposed him to wanting an innocent relationship with someone who could just bring laughter into his life, and that is definitely what Virginia brought to him during their time together. That is not to say that this was appropriate, because if my assumptions here are true, let's be honest, Poe should have been like a nanny to Virginia or even like a stepfather type of figure, not a husband. But from the impression that I got from my research, this wasn't at all a romantic partnership. She was a true companion to him. The relationship was incredibly inappropriate in nature, but there's no evidence to say that either he abused her or that there was a sexual relationship between them at all. So I obviously don't want to condemn him or condemn her without having all of the information. It just seemed honestly like this was kind of a marriage of circumstance because he didn't want Virginia to move away. But to circle back to Poe's death, the horrible tragedies that tuberculosis brought into his life would have had a significant impact on his own physical health as well as his mental health especially. Additionally, he spent all of his time writing, was hugely successful as an author, and yet still lived in poverty for his entire life, which would have a major physical and emotional consequence. That being said, there is no fathomable way that his poor health didn't contribute to the condition that Poe was found in, but this doesn't really explain how he got there. I think that the political kidnapping theory is pretty compelling, mostly just because if this is what happened to Poe, it wouldn't have been an isolated incident. Gunners Hall was notorious as a site for political kidnapping and election fraud. This theory also explains why he went missing for so long, why he wasn't in his own clothes, and why he was in a delirious state if he had been plied to drink with this intolerance that he had. But he was pretty famous and he gave many lectures and readings of his own work in the Baltimore area, so he would have been a pretty unlikely victim, someone at the polls would have obviously recognized him. The theory that Edgar was killed by his fiance's brothers, to be completely honest, I don't want to discredit all the work that this author put into developing this theory, but I don't believe it at all. I totally understand the attitudes towards a relationship like this, considering Poe's financial state and that Elmira was pretty well off, really rich for the time. But other than that, it's kind of unfounded, so I'm going to say no on that one. However, the John Hill Hewitt theory, I want this one to be true so badly. And I know that sounds disrespectful. I don't mean it that way at all. I just think that this entire story is so twisted that the untold truth to lie in a family secret that's endured for generations until one family decided to finally look into their lineage and found this feud between Hewitt and Poe. I think it's just honestly kind of a poetic ending. The validity of it is interesting to think about because, first of all, this was a random person leaving a comment on a YouTube video about the life and death of Edgar Allan Poe, and yet it's pretty convincing in nature because it's a very detailed explanation, but if this person was seeking fame, money, or the ever-present exclusive sell to a news outlet, they would have blasted this theory from the literal rooftops. They wouldn't have just commented it somewhere and then just left it be. The fact that it was this random comment too makes me think that this person would have no reason at all to just make this up and then never do anything with it. So after looking into it, we can definitely confirm this feud between Poe and Hewitt, and not only that, we can see that there was a violent encounter between the two of them, and that Hewitt had a history of being jealous of those who he perceived as more talented and as more successful. The reason then that this theory really gets to me is that Hewitt seems to be the only theory where there's an actual motive against Poe, since the logistics of his fiance's brothers don't make sense at all. And in the political kidnapping theory, it's not exclusive to Poe himself, the motive. There is documented physical evidence through newspaper clippings that these two absolutely hated each other, so it is possible that they ran into each other in another chance encounter in Baltimore, and Hewitt, seeing Poe's already declining health, decided to take advantage and get rid of his rival. Allegedly. I think it's possible, but that's just me, or not, because I want you to let me know what you think about it. But either way, that is the story of the terrifying final days and final hours of literary icon Edgar Allan Poe. The scary world that surrounds Poe, his macabre writings, his clearly broken and suffering mind, as well as his tragic life is a lot to take in, and it's a lot to handle. So let's be sure that his genius and his person don't get lost in all of this morbid curiosity that surrounds his story. He experienced a lot of abandonment, countless losing of loved ones to tuberculosis, and he watched a lot of people that he loved suffer for multiple years before succumbing to this awful disease. He really did experience so much hardship that the fact that he was even able to utilize his gift as an author and as a poet is unbelievable, really. He changed the landscape of American literature, and we see his influence in so many different writings, productions, and even icons and imagery to this day. His legend will always endure, in my opinion, and though questions of his death might never be answered, we will always have the incredible pieces of literature that he put together. And so that is pretty much that. Thank you so much if you've made it this far into the episode, for listening or for watching, which is super exciting. I'm really happy that you spent this time here with me. I think that this story is so fascinating because it's a true example of artwork that has been inspired by pain. And Poe made such an impact on the world around him that it's genuinely incredible considering all that he went through. His death has so many strange things associated with it. I honestly don't know what to think here, and it sucks, but it's also fitting, I think, that we're probably never going to know what actually happened to him. Let me know what you think happened, because I would absolutely love to hear some additional opinions after going through all this information, and I'm really excited to see what other people think about this. All of that being said, though, this episode is coming to a close, so with that, we're going to end this one off. As always, until next time.